Close your eyes and imagine the scent of dust and spices, the rhythmic clang of a tram, and the distant, low murmur of millions. The year is 1924. A century ago, the world was a different place, but nowhere was the clash of old and new, power and resistance, more profound than in India. This was not the India we know today. It was a vast, sprawling entity, a jewel fiercely held within the crown of the British Empire, but the jewel was restless. 1924 stands as a pivotal year, a brief, often overlooked moment where the tectonic plates of history shifted dramatically under the weight of political awakening, economic turmoil, and social change. It was a year where Mahatma Gandhi, the unquestioned leader of the non-violent movement, was fresh out of prison, recovering from surgery, and grappling with the future direction of the struggle. It was a time of both hope and deep division. We begin our journey in the heart of the political storm, examining how the British Raj maintained control and how the seeds of Swaraj, self-rule, were slowly but surely taking root, year by momentous year. The machinery of the British Raj was enormous, complex, and rigid. It was ruled by a viceroy appointed by the Crown, who oversaw a vast civil service, the Indian Civil Service, which was the steel frame governing hundreds of millions of people. The legislative reforms of 1919 had created a limited system of self-governance, but real power remained firmly in British hands. In 1924, Indian politicians were deeply divided on how to proceed, cooperation or non-cooperation. The Congress Party, led by figures like Motilal Nehru and C.R. Das, was split. One faction, the Swarajists, decided to enter the councils to obstruct British legislation from within. Their goal, to make the Government of India Act unworkable. Meanwhile, Gandhi, recovering from his appendicitis surgery and subsequent early release from prison in February 1924, focused on what he saw as the true path to Swaraj, constructive work. He emphasized unity, Khadi, and the upliftment of the untouchable community, the Harijans. This focus led to one of his most important acts of the year, the 21-day fast in September 1924, not against the British, but against the internal poison of Hindu-Muslim disunity, which had flared into deadly riots in places like Kohat. The fast was a dramatic, public plea. It temporarily halted the violence and resulted in the Unity Conference, where leaders of both communities pledged peace. It was a potent, moral victory, proving the immense power of his non-violent method, Satyagraha. But the political landscape was not just about Congress. Revolutionary nationalism, though suppressed, still simmered. Young radicals, impatient with the slow pace of non-violence, began reorganizing, ready for militant action. In the South, the non-Brahmin movement was gaining crucial momentum, challenging the caste hierarchy and demanding social justice and political representation for the masses previously excluded from power. Meanwhile, the vast network of princely states, which covered about 2/5 of India's territory, existed in a strange duality. They were technically sovereign, but effectively puppets of the Raj, bound by treaties and the presence of a British resident. 1924 was a political kaleidoscope. Gandhi's moral high ground, the Swarajists' tactical battles, and the quiet, persistent demands of social justice movements. All of it building towards an inevitable clash. The constant tension was simple. The British viewed India as a permanent possession. Indians were beginning to see themselves as a nation with an undeniable right to freedom. This was the fundamental, non-negotiable divide. The year culminated in the Belgaum session of the Congress in December. This was the only time Gandhi ever presided over the Congress. It symbolized his temporary return to direct political control, urging unity and the power of the spinning wheel. It was a reminder that the path to independence would be long, fraught with internal conflict, but ultimately guided by the unique, moral philosophy of Satyagraha. The political stage was set for the decade to come. The British would continue their attempts to divide and rule, while Indian leaders would struggle to unify their massive, diverse, and increasingly politicized population. 1924 was the year India found its political equilibrium after the initial shock of the non-cooperation movement, taking a necessary pause to reorganize before the storm of civil disobedience was unleashed years later. The politics were only one side of the coin. The economic realities of the time, the poverty, the hunger, and the industrial might of the British told an equally compelling and tragic story. India in 1924 was an agrarian economy under the control of a burgeoning industrial power. The vast majority of the population, over 80%, lived in villages, dependent on the fickle monsoon and paying heavy land taxes to the British administration. The land revenue system, particularly the permanent settlement in certain areas, had created a class of wealthy landlords, zamindars, who often exploited the tenant farmers, leaving them perpetually indebted and poor. Agriculture was the backbone, but it was often a fragile one. The ghost of famine was always present. A bad monsoon meant starvation for millions, a stark testament to the lack of infrastructure and effective relief from the colonial government. Yet, pockets of industry were growing. The textile mills of Bombay and Ahmedabad, the jute mills of Calcutta, and the coal mines of Bihar were engines of industrial activity, largely managed by British capital, but with growing involvement from Indian industrialists like the Cottage and Birlas. These factories, however, were brutal places to work. In 1924, labour laws were weak, and workers faced grueling hours, poor pay, and dangerous conditions. Child labour was rampant, a sad reality of the early industrial age. The burgeoning labour movement began to take shape, demanding better conditions and fair wages. Strikes and protests, though often brutally suppressed, were becoming more common, adding another layer of resistance to the Raj. The cornerstone of British economic policy was to treat India as both a source of cheap raw materials and a captive market for finished British goods. This policy had devastating effects on India's traditional cottage industries, especially handloom weaving. Gandhi's call for Khadi was not just a political symbol. It was a potent economic countermeasure. It encouraged self-sufficiency, giving the poor villagers an independent income source and hitting back at British textile imports. The infrastructure of the Raj, the vast railway network, the telegraph lines, and the ports was built primarily to serve British strategic and economic interests, moving troops and resources from the interior to the coast for export. The growing urban middle class, educated in English, were experiencing a period of rising expectations and limited opportunities. They were the clerks, the lawyers, the doctors, the vital engine of the independence movement, fueled by economic discontent. 1920 foresaw the global economic reverberations of the post-WWI era affecting India. The rupee-sterling ratio and tariffs were constant topics of fierce debate, where Indian interests were frequently sacrificed for the stability of the empire. The economic reality was a two-tiered system, a small, wealthy European and elite Indian class benefiting from the trade and administration, and a massive, struggling population bearing the costs of empire. The fight for political freedom was, therefore, inseparable from the fight for economic justice. The spinning wheel was a symbol of both. The economic story of 1924 is one of exploitation, but also of quiet, determined self-reliance. Beyond the political and economic turmoil, 1924 was a year of fascinating social and cultural transitions. Traditional Indian society, rigid and caste-based, was slowly being eroded by Western education, urbanization, and the revolutionary ideas of national identity. The position of women was beginning to change, albeit slowly. While many were still confined to the home, education was opening doors for a small but significant number to participate in public life, particularly in the political movement. Reform movements continued their work to abolish social evils like untouchability and child marriage. Figures like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, though only recently returned from his studies, were preparing to launch a full-scale assault on the Hindu caste system. Urbanization was rapid. Cities like Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras became melting pot places where diverse languages, religions, and social classes mixed, creating a new, vibrant, and often volatile metropolitan culture. The arts flourished. The Bengali Renaissance was still potent, with figures like Rabindranath Tagore continuing to influence literature, music, and painting, blending deep Indian spirituality with modern, universal themes. This was the golden age of early Indian cinema. The silent films of Dada Saheb Phalke were captivating the public, offering escapism and a new way for Indians to see their own myths and stories on the big screen. Sports, particularly cricket, had become a complex cultural space. While introduced by the British, Indian teams and players were beginning to assert their dominance, turning the colonial game into a source of national pride. The great tension, however, remained the communal divide. Despite Gandhi's fast and the efforts for unity, the rising political aspirations were increasingly channeled through religious identity, leading to the heartbreaking riots of 1924. The media played a critical role. Vernacular newspapers and journals boomed, spreading political ideas, social critique, and news to the masses in their own languages, often circumventing British censorship. The British policy of divide and rule was often subtle, using separate electorates and official support for certain community leaders to fragment the national movement. The social landscape was a minefield of potential conflict. Education, though primarily geared towards creating clerks for the Raj, was ironically the engine of resistance. It exposed the Indian youth to ideas of liberty, self-determination, and democracy, directly challenging the colonial narrative. In the villages, the daily life remained largely unchanged by the distant political battles, governed by ancient customs, the rhythm of the seasons, and the authority of the local elders. It was a world untouched by the modern currents of Delhi or London. Yet, even here, Gandhi's message of Swaraj and Khadi began to filter through, carried by itinerant political workers, travelling performers, and the powerful symbolism of the spinning wheel. 1924 was a year of social awakening. The old order was fading, the new was struggling to be born. It was a time of immense cultural production, a nation in the act of defining itself against an imperial master. It was a society marked by stark contradictions, deep poverty alongside princely wealth, modern thought struggling against ancient prejudice, the yearning for unity constantly threatened by the shadow of division. This was the complex reality of India 100 years ago. The year 1924 was a momentary lull, a strategic regrouping. The non-cooperation movement had been suspended, but the spirit of resistance had not. It simply changed form, moving from the mass street protest to the legislative council, the village workshop, and the inner moral struggle of its leaders. The lessons of the year were profound. The battle for India's soul would require not just political confrontation, but social reform and economic self-sufficiency. Gandhi's insistence on the constructive program saved the movement from despair and gave it a deep, popular root. The challenges of 1924 communal tension, economic disparity, and political division sadly cast long shadows that continue to affect India today. Yet, the seeds of the world's largest democracy were undeniably sown in that unquiet dawn a century ago. The rhythmic click of the spinning wheel in 1924 was the sound of a nation slowly, steadily, weaving its own future, thread by powerful thread. A century later, its echoes remain.